Toph's top 5 because 10 is too many. Toph's top 5 because Snubs is too busy. Toph's top 5, I don't know what he's up to, but he's clearly busy. So let's talk about some tunes, cause it's Toph's top 5. Yeah!
Hey, hey, ho, 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 ho. Yeah. Hey, everybody. Yeah. Rock your body. Yeah. Everybody. Rock your body, right? Toph's top 5 is back. All right. It's good to be with you. It's been a bit. I think this is officially the 10th Toph's top 5. This is actually going to be a two-parter because this group, there's no possible way you could come up with 5 from the entire catalog, which, by the way, I think as I was thinking about doing these guys, I thought, you know what? It just wouldn't be fair to try and do a Toph's top 5 episode on Chicago or the Chicago Transit Authority, as they were originally called. I was watching Jeopardy the other day, and that was one of the questions of the original name of the band. And they all got it wrong. Nobody got Chicago Transit Authority. I think one person said Chicago Transit Association, which was wrong. Ken Jennings had to tell him, sorry, incorrect. But anyway, I kind of said, if I'm realistically going to do this group, I have to listen to the whole catalog. So it was a commitment. It was a real commitment because not only do these guys have officially 38 releases, 26 of them are studio albums. And these guys, particularly later in their career, have certainly, I think they've done 4 Christmas albums and a big band. I mean, they've certainly figured out ways to get into the commerce of it all. But in terms of legit studio albums, you're looking at, 17, 18. When you strip out the live stuff and the greatest hits stuff and the compilation stuff. So it's a commitment. And not only are there a lot of albums, but some of them are really long. The first few, there were a lot of double LPs. So, with a lot of long pieces and such. I mean, it's definitely, if you're ever going to, I think it took a month to legitimately get to know every record because I listened to all of them twice. But it just wasn't, you're not going to just throw out a top 5 without exploring the space that Chicago had to offer. And Lord knows there was plenty of space. This is a pretty crazy band. Before we get into it, let's do the album worth mentioning.
I will now sell 5 copies of the 3 EPs by the beta band.
Okay, quick and easy. Typo Negative reissued Life is Killing Me, which probably, I know we did the Two Twins episode about October Rust. October Rust is incredible. And Life is Killing Me might be as good. It might even be I don't know, if I had to pick one and take it with me, it would probably end up being October Rust, but Life is Killing Me would be really close. Just get it. They reissued it. They remastered it. And just get it. I mean, shout out to listener Andrew, Mountaineer out there, who you do these shows and you kind of wonder all the time if anybody, gives a crap or goes to actually listen to some of the stuff we've talked about. And from scratch, I believe we've converted him into, well, not really converted, just created a Typo Negative fan. So shout out to you, brother. But Life is Killing Me, that's the album worth mentioning. So I'm going to divide this into two because there's really kind of like two Chicagos. If you look at the sort of distinct eras of the band, there's the first era, which is kind of the Terry Kath era. And then there's post Terry Kath, which essentially became the David Foster, Peter Cetera, you know, a little bit of Diane Warren in there. You know, they started to bring in some songwriters, but I think it's a crazy group. The catalog is insane and just all over the place, but that's kind of the charm of the group. Really, the era we're going to talk about here on part one, which is 1969 to 1977, is really driven by what started as kind of a more of a rock approach led by Terry Kath, but also incorporating this unique sound of the horns and brass sections, which is a Chicago trademark in terms of the band. And they've kind of always had it in one way or another, sort of tailed off a little bit in part two, but we'll get to that later. And really a democracy, a group approach of contributions, you know, coming from a lot of different people. In fact, the guy who plays the trombone, Jim Pankow, might be like the best songwriter in the band. And the top five here for part one actually has one Peter Cetera composition, one James Pankow composition, one by Robert Lamb, one by Pankow and Lamb, and one by Cetera and Pankow. So James Pankow's all over this thing. It's a crazy band in that things kind of started fairly stripped down, even though there was a lot of instrumentation, particularly related to horns. And that instrumentation only sort of expanded over time. But at the beginning, it was, you know, I think it started a little bit simpler. Now, if you go back and listen, I don't want to talk too much about the debut album because, in fact, I don't want to talk too much about the band in general because we might, you know, lo and behold, do an episode about this, an album episode about it someday. But Terry Kath, for those that aren't aware, had one of the strangest and sort of wildest deaths you could ever think of. And part one really is the Terry Kath era for the group. Now, that doesn't mean that he was the lead dog, because even by the time things started to wrap up here, you were really seeing the emergence of Peter Cetera, who again is represented still pretty damn well here on this top five for part one. You can imagine he'll be represented pretty well in part two. But Kath died in 1977, right at the end of the range that we're covering here on part one. Probably the most interesting, tragic, strange ways of dying I could think of, besides maybe Bud Dwyer. Those of you that don't know, but Bud Dwyer was a Pennsylvania politician who got up and did he was being accused of all kinds of corruption and everything. And he got up and gave this like long rambling speech about nothing really. And then pulled out this giant gun out of an envelope and blew his head off, like right in front of the media and stuff, TV cameras and everything. It's crazy. Terry Kath also shot himself, but it was accidental, where he was like screwing around with one of his buddies, sitting in an office, I think at his desk chair or something. And he was, I think it was a revolver, and he was kind of screwing around with the chamber and saying, "Oh, it's not loaded. Look," and proving it's not loaded, held the gun up to his head and pulled the trigger, and it was loaded, and he just blew his head off. And he had, you know, some alcohol problems and some substance abuse problems and those things, but still it was like, it's just like insane. Way to go. And, you know, particularly for somebody who was a founding member and so important to this group. So, you know, there's a lot to this era, and certainly there was evolution of the group throughout this era from 69 to 77. But obviously they were able to pull up their bootstraps and pick up and figure out a way to continue granted in a totally different direction, and we'll get into that in part 2. So for part 1, we're going to dive into, this era that really saw the release of some pretty creative albums. And after the debut, you saw these double LPs, throughout the early 70s that had these kind of long suites, kind of multifaceted compositions to them, which really you saw pretty consistently throughout the first, 3 or 4 records. And these are long pieces that are sectioned off, and in most cases, some pretty creative, interesting stuff. And they were a good radio band. I mean, they could, hit top 40, they could hit rock radio. They were just kind of diverse enough to be able to, apply to a lot of different elements across the board. And so this was a really experimental era for the band, even from the get-go. One thing you can't take away from these guys is they weren't just going to hit it down the middle, every single time they went out. I mean, they were commercial and they had commercial interest, but they did a pretty good job of balancing that with the effort to be creative and be unique and sometimes be a little bit kind of off the beaten path in their approach, which I think is part of what made them interesting and part of what gave them longevity. This wasn't just your sort of 70s like AOR group that was kicking out ballads and kicking out, songs that were solely made for the radio. No, I think that happened later, when David Foster came into the mix and all that kind of stuff, but we'll get there. But for now, what you see is a very kind of diverse approach and a lot to choose from. I mean, when you listen to every single album from these cats, there's no shortage of selections. So we've got our top 5. I told you already who the songwriters are. And then we've got 6 honorable mentions, which with this band, I don't know how you're going to get away with having much less than that. But let's get right into it here as we go through part 1 of Toph's top 5 for Chicago, 1969 to 1977. Away we go. All right. So basically we're going from the debut album here, which was Chicago Transit Authority, and we're taking that up to Chicago 11, the 1977 record.
Number 5. Number 5.
Please, call me Johnny 5.
Johnny, you have taken name for yourself?
This first one, speaking of, is on that very album, Chicago 11. And this is the track that's on here that Peter Cetera is fully responsible for, which would be the case in many instances, but didn't happen right away. It sort of took him a while to really kind of emerge as a songwriter and frankly, even emerge as a vocalist. I mean, he was always a vocalist, but in terms of being essentially the voice of the band, that was not something that happened right away and kind of evolved. But, you kind of look back and wonder, it's like, God, with that voice and how good it sounded in the studio and all that, like what took them so long. But by this point, their 11th record, track 2, was one that he wrote, he sang, and they probably knew was going to be the next big song for them at the time, going back to 1977 with Baby What a Big Surprise. The thing I like is it's clearly a ballad, but one with tempo, one with great instrumentation, and not anything that's too sappy. Great vocal. Carl Wilson sang backup. My favorite Beach Boy. My guy, Carl Wilson, as well as Peter Cetera's brother, Tim. So who knew? So this was the band's last top 10 single before Terry Kath died. Really Peter Cetera establishing himself. He had written If You Leave Me Now, which obviously was a huge hit and was his own, but this was kind of the next step for him in really becoming the voice of the band. It's a really well-produced song. I mean, a lot of the vocal layering and dynamics, the instrumentation is excellent with strings, and that acoustic guitar is really evident. And on that note, it was James Guercio was the longtime producer since the get-go of Chicago, almost like an additional member. And this was the last sort of big single produced by him. So we're kind of beginning with the end here of the time range and the era that we're focusing on. But coming in at number 5 is that great classic song from Chicago, Baby What a Big Surprise. Let's get to number 4 for Chicago.
4! Fine shot. Oh! I should have yelled 2.
All right, I mentioned earlier the notion of having these sort of long pieces, these suites, these opuses, these whatever you want to call them. This one was a very famous long piece from their second record, which was kind of their first that I think really got to be musical, whimsical. CTA was the debut, was more straightforward, while there were a lot of moments that are super interesting. This is, this was a double LP, and what made up basically all of side 2 is a 13-minute piece called Ballet for a Girl in Buchanan, which was something that in later years you saw the band many, many times play in full to open their shows, which must have been pretty cool. The most famous, most renowned, and certainly a song that got me very interested in this band decades ago when I first started to dig in past just the stuff I had seen in music videos and look at some of their older stuff. One of the tracks that jumped out then and has held up extremely well and still jumps out when I hear it, from the Ballet for a Girl in Buchanan, Make Me Smile. Really the song that put them on the map. They didn't really have a distinct commercial hit really until this. Written by James Pankow, as I said from the beginning, the trumpet player who over time throughout every area of Chicago is really a hell of a songwriter. And he wrote this entire ballet. Terry Kath is on the lead vocal. So early example of kind of who was the voice of the band at that point, Kath, with that kind of rough, edgy vocal, which really makes for a good fit for the energy of the song. It was certainly their breakthrough hit. It got modified with the intro, and there was a section right here, actually, that was later in the suite that got added to create the single for Make Me Smile. So yeah, when you hear that song as part of the entire ballet, it's more of a section of it. Great drum solo there at the end. I think more songs need to end with drum solos. I'm sure Nubs would agree. Let's get to number 3. We're going to the debut record here, and This is a pretty amazing album when you go back and listen to it. You know, you had some really interesting elements on this first record. Long songs, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, 6 minutes were kind of the standard here. A 14.5-minute closer. This record got inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2014 for a reason. When you listen to kind of Chicago's later stuff and you go back to this, it's like, don't even think it's the same guys. But the album closes in pretty interesting fashion where side 4, also a double album here, is a prologue, a song, and then a closer that is 14.5 minutes called Liberation. And coming in at number 3 is the second to last track, which was written by James Pankow, again, co-written by Robert Lamb, sung by Robert Lamb and Peter Cetera. And it's a pretty cool way to set up the last track and follows the prologue, August 29th, 1968. This is Someday.
Now you know what I mean. Someday you will see how long we've waited for the time to show you how we've died to get together with you.
Great friggin' vocal there by Cetera, the unmistakable Peter Cetera. Even back in 1969, you could tell exactly who that was. It's kind of an interesting song with these interludes with chanting. The full title of the song is Someday, August 29th, 1968. So there's a little bit of a concept going on here, which I think encompasses the entire side, but we won't get into all that. It's a dual vocal, always a sucker for the dual vocal. Robert Lamb and Peter Cetera, who did that quite often and did it very effectively.
Turn your head around till everything's unclear. Twist and turn your arm around until it is not there. And they'd love to burn you.
So many good voices in the group, and we already heard Kath. Now we've heard Lamb and Cetera. All very recognizable, all very signature at given times in the band's era.
And tell us what's to be. Can you look inside yourself and tell us what you see? As you feel the rumblings.
Second to last track on Chicago Transit Authority, Someday, comes in at number 3. Maybe a deep cut. Some might consider. Most would probably consider. But that's the beauty. You go back, you commit to taking the 3.5 years that it took me to get through this band's catalog. These are the kind of gems that you pick up, and plenty to choose from on that album that were top 5 worthy. But Someday, August 29th, 1968, comes in at number 3. Let's go to number 2.
Utah, give me 2.
We're going back to Chicago 3 here, which again, double record, pretty long album. And in my opinion, probably their best, top to bottom. Now, it's a long listen. You got the Travel Suite, which has some awesome elements to it. This is a Robert Lamb song. So we're going back to back Lamb here. This is a pretty amazing album. I know they had a lot to sort of follow up on from 2, and 3 isn't really chalked as much with kind of more singles as you saw in those first 2, particularly led by Make Me Smile off of 2. And then Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is? Beginnings, Questions. These were all songs on the debut. So this one, not, I don't think aiming for singles, but certainly this record, I think, produced something really creative and really interesting. And right in the middle, right smack dab in the middle of this record is a song that kicks off side 3. Lyrics written by Robert Lamb, music written by Robert Lamb, and lead vocals sung by Robert Lamb. This is Mother.
Looking, yeah, around, how did now see
That driving beat there is really cool. And then kind of weaves throughout these different sections. The middle section is this crazy like horn off with like these back and forth horns going, and it's pretty cool. This kind of reminds you of sort of improvisation, kind of jazz rock at that point. And then the main riff sort of comes back in later. So takes you in a lot of different directions, this one does. There's that crazy horn off, and then it eventually brings you back into the main part here. This song probably does more in 4.5 minutes than any other song ever recorded. It's pretty nuts in terms of everything that it accomplishes, but the main piece is kind of this driving beat, which kind of brings it, certainly intros the first minute and a half or so of the song, and then kind of brings it back down to normalcy after that long instrumental. Pretty amazing, you know. It's a 4.5 minute song, and you get to the end and you're like, okay, was that like 20 minutes? Because that just did a lot. That's part of the reason I like it. Coming in at number 2 off Chicago 3 is Mother. So one of the things about the number 1 song here, as we wrap up part 1, is it was the closer off Chicago 6. And one of the things I want to note is these guys were really good at album closers. In fact, if you look at, I'll go ahead and spoil the honorable mentions now, but Skinny Boy off 7 is one of them. That's the closer on Chicago 7. Old Days is another. That's the closer on Chicago 8. And there's a couple we'll talk about in part 2, but they, you know, these guys really knew how to, in fact, there's a few on part 2, but these guys knew how to take a good song and put it at the end of an album, which again showed me one of the good things about these guys is they could have just kicked out singles constantly, but you know, they cared about putting out records that were pieces that sort of took you in different directions and in some cases kind of drew you out to some interesting instrumentation and journeys and improvisation. I mean, these guys were definitely musicians first, but just so happened to know how to write a good single. And that is exactly how you would describe number 1, which is the final song off Chicago 6.
It's a good thing. It's the best.
Coming in at number 1, written by James Pinko and Peter Cetera, of course. What a closer to Chicago 6, and what a great track, Feeling Stronger Every Day. Kind of a build-up, right? So, you know, there's not a true verse, chorus, verse structure to this. But the first part kind of takes you through the 2 sections that build you up, and then a little breakdown, and then we go ballistic at the end, right? But essentially a 2-part song that kind of drags for the first half, but definitely builds towards eventually where it takes you with a really cool musical interlude here. Great Hohner piano there from Robert Lamb. We talked about a bunch on the Supertramp episode, but the song's about Peter Cetera's marriage at the time, which was fizzling, and which gives you kind of some feeling to the song. It's kind of an upbeat song, but countered by lyrics that were about an unfortunate topic, but Cetera says we're giving him kind of a feeling of a new start and strength at the time. The song was written pretty quickly. Cetera overheard James Pankow just doing a little jam, which was actually the intro to the song. They were on a rain delay at an outdoor gig in Akron, Ohio, and Peter said, "What's that?" Pankow said, "I don't know, I'm just screwing around," and they started riffing off of it together. And the first thing they did when the tour ended is they said, "Let's pick up on that thing we were working on in Akron," and it became Feeling Stronger Every Day. So there you go. Number one, Feeling Stronger Every Day. Peter Cetera takes you home with that song that not only wraps up the 6 record, but wraps up part 1 of Toph's Top 5. So we sort of began at the end with Baby What a Big Surprise on 11, then went to the beginning with Make Me Smile off 2, and even further to the beginning with Someday, August 29th, 1968, off of Chicago Transit Authority, Mother off Chicago 3, and then coming in at the top spot, Feeling Stronger Every Day off 6. So what happens now? Terry Kath strangely and tragically dies. And the band, who was experiencing some kind of rough patches commercially, sort of dabbling in disco and some other sounds, had to kind of regroup and say, what is our next era? And we will get to that era next as we dig into part 2. But that's a wrap on part 1 for Chicago, 1969 to 1977. We will see you very shortly for part 2.